In 1918, you remember the Germans broke through in March. It looked bad. They were pretty strong. We had to do an awful lot of marching, and marching at night. And I remember this night he said, we got a long distance to go tonight, and it's hard, and I'm going to give you a little poem. This was fun. Didn't amount to much, but we all had a good laugh. He says, I have a dog, and his name is Towser. And he is a very smart pup. He will stand upon his hind legs when you hold his front legs up. And there was a lot of humorous, and that's what kept it going.
War is supposed to be grim. It's supposed to be mud, fear, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. And in the First World War, especially in the trenches, all of that was true. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. The war was also full of humor, strange, sharp, unexpected humor, and some of the most bizarre stories you'll ever hear. And I think it's high time we had some comic relief, CEF style. Canadian soldiers looked at a screaming artillery shell and casually named it a whiz-bang, as if it were a firework instead of a weapon. They called German mortars flying pigs, renamed machine guns potato diggers, and used their bayonets as tin openers and toasting forks. They joked about the food, the officers, the weather, and even the enemy. And it wasn't just slang. The First World War is packed with stories that sound like they were written by a dark comedy writer. A bear became a Canadian mascot and later inspired Winnie the Pooh. Soldiers held mock trials for trench cats accused of stealing rations. Entire battalions wrote poetry about rum rations. And in the middle of the mud and the misery, someone always found a way to laugh. Humor didn't make the war less deadly, but it made it more survivable. It gave soldiers a way to stay human in a place designed to break them. Today, we're stepping into that world, the slang, the satire, and the strange, unforgettable stories that reveal a side of the Canadian Expeditionary Force and of the First World War itself that history books rarely show. Because sometimes the best way to understand a war is to listen to the jokes told in the trench. Welcome to the 24th episode of Memory and Valor, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the individual stories and quiet sacrifices of Canadian veterans and soldiers. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thanks for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. If history matters to you, you can support the show by going to buymeacoffee.com, search up Memory and Valor, and just buy me a coffee. It's as simple as that, and it really helps keep the show going. Also, make sure to follow Memory and Valor wherever you like to stream your podcast content. That helps get the word out about the podcast and gives me more exposure, which is really great. And now on with the show. Historians sometimes struggle with this subject of humor in the war. Talking about laughter in the First World War can almost feel disrespectful, as if acknowledging humor risks minimizing the suffering. The mud, the terror, and the loss, it all feels too heavy and too sacred to pair with jokes. But Canadian historian Tim Cook put it plainly when he wrote that it seems almost blasphemous to suggest that trench soldiers joked. But of course they did. Humour, he said, was a safety valve, a release, a pressure system built into the human spirit. Because if humour wasn't there, something else had to give. And in the trenches, that thing that gave was often a man's sanity. The Canadian War Museum makes this point again and again. Humor wasn't decoration. It wasn't a distraction from reality. It wasn't soldiers pretending things were fine. It was a way of staying human in a place that constantly tried to strip that away. One Canadian trench newspaper even spelled it out for its readers. It promised that its pages were open to every complaint in the battalion, whether real or imagined. Complaining wasn't discouraged. It was understood and it was healthy. It was a reminder that you were still thinking, still feeling, and still alive. Silence was far more dangerous. And that's the heart of trench humor. It wasn't about making light of war. It was about refusing to be crushed by it. It was about carving out tiny pockets of control in a world where control barely existed. It was about saying, I'm still here, even when everything around you suggested otherwise. One of the clearest places this humor showed up was in language. Canadian soldiers renamed almost everything, and they did it with a kind of instinctive creativity that came straight from the gut. They didn't sit around workshopping clever nicknames. They weren't trying to be funny. They were trying to get through a day. And one of the easiest ways to survive something terrifying, as we all know, is to rename it into something you can handle. Artillery was the perfect example. So again, a small, fast German shell earned the name whiz-bang, not because an officer thought it sounded cool, but because the men noticed something very specific about it. Private Donald Fraser described it in the most matter-of-fact way possible. First you heard the whiz, and almost at the same moment the bang. That was it. Observation turned into language, and language turned into control. And once the soldiers realized that they could do that they could rename the things that frightened them, the floodgates opened. German mortars became flying pigs, toffee apples, and plum puddings, to name a few. Imagine standing in a trench, watching a heavy explosive arc through the air toward you, and your instinct is to call it a dessert. That wasn't denial, guys. This was defiance. It was a way of saying, you don't get to scare me on your terms. I'll decide what you are. I think we're all familiar with this. Machine guns got the same treatment. The Colt machine gun, with its frantic, jerking motion, became the potato digger, as if it were out in a field somewhere helping with the harvest instead of cutting men down. The name stuck so firmly that even official reports slipped and sometimes used it. And then there were the bayonets. Officially, they were absolutely deadly weapons, cold steel meant for close combat. Unofficially, they were tin openers or can openers, toasting forks, toothpicks, rat stabbers, and winkle pins. Soldiers used them for everything, so opening cans, cooking food, prying things loose, poking at rats. The humor wasn't in pretending the bayonet wasn't dangerous, it was in refusing to let the danger define it. Turning something meant to kill into something meant for the kitchen didn't make it harmless, but it made it manageable. It made it more ordinary, and if you could make it ordinary, you could make it less scary. This was the quiet genius of trench slang. It wasn't just vocabulary, it was emotional engineering. It was soldiers reshaping their world, one nickname at a time, until it felt just a little less impossible to endure. This same instinct, the instinct to soften the edges of fear, extended far beyond language. It seeped into the stories that the soldiers told, the mascots that they adopted, and the tiny pockets of gentleness they carved out in a world that offered almost none. And sometimes those stories grew into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. One of the most famous characters in the world actually has roots in this same landscape of mud, uniforms, and soldiers far from home. In 1914, a young Canadian officer named Harry Colborne was traveling east by train, heading toward a military training camp in Quebec, Valcartier. He was a veterinarian by professor, which is why he was attached to the Canadian Army Veterinary Corps. This was a unit responsible for caring for the thousands of horses the Army depended on. During a stop in White River, Ontario, Colborne noticed a trapper at the station with a small black bear cub for sale. The cub's mother had been killed, and the man was trying to make a few bucks. Colborne, who had spent his life around animals, felt an immediate pull. On impulse, and for $20, he bought her. He named her Winnie, after his hometown of Winnipeg. From that moment on, Winnie became something more than a mascot. She became a companion, a source of comfort, a reminder of home. She followed the soldiers onto trains. She wandered freely around camp. She played with them, climbed on them, and posed for photographs like she belonged there, because in a way she did. For a time, she was woven into their daily routine, a small, warm presence in a world that was rapidly growing colder. When the unit shipped overseas, Colborne faced a difficult truth. Winnie couldn't go into the trenches. The front lines were no place for a bear, no matter how gentle. So he arranged for her to stay at the London Zoo for the duration of the war, promising he would return for her when it was over. Winnie quickly became a sensation. Visitors adored her, and children fed her from their hands. She was calm, affectionate, and unusually trusting for a bear raised by soldiers. She became one of the zoo's most beloved animals, and among the children who visited her was a little boy named Christopher Robin Milne. He became so attached to Winnie that he renamed his own stuffed bear after her. And years later, his father, the writer A. Milne, took that name and that toy and spun them into stories that would become Winnie the Pooh. It's a soft, almost unbelievable connection, a gentle children's classic growing out of the chaos of the First World War, but it's also a reminder of something pretty important, that even in the middle of industrialized warfare, soldiers still reached for comfort, for companionship, for things that felt alive and gentle and safe. Mascots like Winnie weren't frivolous, they weren't distractions, they were actually anchors, like emotional lifelines in a world that offered very few. Humor and affection were not luxuries, they were survival strategies, and sometimes they left behind legacies far bigger than anyone in those trenches could have imagined. Pretty cool. So let's move on to musical humor, because I don't know anybody who can't turn humor into a song or vice versa. Every army has its songs, but the First World War produced one of the strangest, bleakest, and funniest of them all. I'm not going to sing it for you, but the lyrics are, "We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here." That's it. That's the whole song. It was sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, usually at night, usually off-key, and usually by men who were cold, exhausted, and fed up with absolutely everything. There were no verses, no chorus, no clever wordplay, just the same line repeated over and over until everyone either laughed or gave up, and that was the point. The song captured the monotony of trench life better than any diary entry ever could. Days blurred together and weeks vanished. Soldiers rotated in and out of the line without any sense of progress. They weren't advancing and they weren't retreating. They were just there. So they sang, "We're here because we're here." It was a joke, but it was also a truth. It was a way of saying, we don't know why we're still alive or why we're still in this trench or what tomorrow looks like, but we're here. British soldier Edward Dwyer recorded the song in August 1916 and described it as something men sang when there was nothing else to do but wait. And waiting was an enemy too, the endless hours between danger, the boredom that gnawed at morale, just as surely as fear. The first half of this recording is Dwyer himself, speaking and then giving us his rendition of the song.
There was only one thing you could cheer us up on the march, that was singing. We used to sing Tipperary choruses, invented by some of the chaps. Tipperary was in full swing then, and they'd always gone to something they'd invented themselves. It used to buck us up, and we would march all the better for it. Sometimes we'd sing some of T.H. Eliot's songs, you know, the chocolate-coloured coon, but we'd always go into something we'd invented. I don't think I've got much of a voice for singing, but I try and sing one or two of the choruses we used to sing. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We'd be far better off, far better off, far better off in a hug. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Woo!
We're here because we're here. We're
Edward Dwyer was killed in action at Guillemont, France on 3 September 1916, probably just a few weeks after giving us that recording. His grave is located at Flatiron Copse Military Cemetery in France. The song became kind of a communal shrug. It was a protest without anger, kind of a coping mechanism disguised as nonsense, and it turned the crushing sameness of trench life into something you could laugh at or at least endure. In a war where soldiers had almost zero control over anything, choosing to sing a ridiculous song together was its own small act of defiance. It was a reminder that even when nothing made sense, they still had each other. Going forward, some of the songs you'll hear in this episode were popularized in the 1969 film Oh, What a Lovely War, and I've used them here to help bring the soldiers' humor and the culture to life. The First World War is often remembered for its brutality, and rightly so, but tucked inside that vast, devastating conflict are stories so strange and unexpected and sometimes so funny that they almost feel like they belong to another world entirely. These aren't footnotes, they're reminders that even in the middle of catastrophe, human beings remained, well, human. Let's explore a few of the most surprising ones. We've already talked about Winnie the Pooh, but she wasn't the only animal to find herself adopted by soldiers. Not even close. Mascots were everywhere in the First World War. There were dogs, goats, pigs, cats, even the occasional fox. If it wandered into a camp and didn't immediately run away, chances are someone fed it, named it, and declared it as part of the unit. Some battalions had entire traveling menageries. Animals followed them from camp to camp, from training grounds to transport ships, and sometimes even overseas. They appeared in photographs, in letters home, and in trench newspapers. They were companions, entertainers, and emotional anchors in a world that offered very few. Cats were especially beloved, partly because they hunted rats, and the trenches were absolutely overrun with rats, and partly because soldiers saw something of themselves in these animals. Cats were stubborn, independent, resilient. They slept anywhere, they tolerated anything, and had a knack for surviving situations that should have killed them. In other words, they were trench-worthy. And soldiers just didn't keep cats around. They built entire stories around them. There are accounts of trench cats being put on mock trial for stealing rations, complete with a jury of soldiers who took the proceedings far too seriously. The charges were read aloud, witnesses were called, arguments were made with dramatic flair, and the cat, usually sitting in the middle of the courtroom licking its paw, was always acquitted. Of course it was. You can't imprison morale. Dogs played their own roles too. Some of them were mascots, some were companions, and some became working animals. They even carried messages, sniffing out wounded soldiers, or simply lying beside men who needed something warm and alive to hold on to or snuggle up to. A few dogs became so famous within their units that they were given unofficial ranks, medals, or uniforms tailored just for them. We'll do another episode on pets in the trenches, and we'll talk specifically about dogs who actually earned the rank of sergeant. That's another time. Goats were another favorite. Goats in trenches. They were hardy, stubborn, and endlessly entertaining. Some regiments marched with goats at the head of their columns as if the animal were leading the charge. Others kept goats simply because they made people laugh, and in the trenches that was reason enough. Even pigs made appearances. Not as food, though I'm sure it was always a temptation, but as mascots. Soldiers taught them tricks, dressed them up, and wrote about them in trench newspapers as if they were eccentric members of the battalion. And then there were the foxes. These were wild, unpredictable, and completely unsuited to military life, which made them perfect mascots. A fox in camp was a novelty. It was a distraction, a spark of chaos in a world that had become too orderly in its misery. So these animals weren't just pets, they were symbols of normalcy. They were reminders of home, of gentleness, of life beyond the mud and wire. They gave the soldiers something to care for, something to laugh at, something to protect even. In a place where everything was designed to break the human spirit, animal mascots helped hold it together. Humor and affection weren't luxuries, they were lifelines, and sometimes those lifelines had fur, paws, hooves, or claws. Moving on now to something else. Tickler's jam tins. They were everywhere in the trenches. Everywhere. They were part of the daily ration, so soldiers ate from them constantly. Thick, sugary jam, usually apple jam, that stuck to everything and tasted vaguely of metal. Once the tins were empty, they didn't get thrown away. Nothing in the trenches ever really got thrown away. Instead, the tins became tools. They became cooking pots, storage containers, makeshift cups, even candle holders. But the most creative and the most dangerous use came when soldiers started turning them into improvised grenades. These homemade explosives were nicknamed Tickler's Artillery, and the name stuck so firmly that it appeared in trench newspapers and soldiers' letters. One Canadian soldier joked that the jam tins were, quote, the most versatile piece of equipment in the entire army, adding that they were good for everything except jam, end quote. Another wrote that the tins were, quote, worth their weight in gold, provided you filled them with something that explodes, end quote. The process was simple, in the way that only something incredibly risky can seem simple. You packed the empty tin with gun cotton or explosives, added bits of scrap metal or nails for shrapnel, you fitted a fuse and hoped, sincerely, that it didn't go off in your hand. These improvised grenades weren't elegant or standardized, and they certainly weren't safe, but they worked. And more importantly, they gave soldiers a sense of agency in a war where they had very little. It's hard to imagine a more Canadian combination: resourcefulness, danger, and a touch of humor. The Strathy Language Unit's research on trench slang notes that soldiers often used humor to cope with fear, and Tickler's Artillery is a perfect example. To take something ordinary, the jam tin, and turn it into something extraordinary. It transformed a ration into a weapon, a joke into a survival tool. One soldier summed it up best when he wrote, quote, if the army didn't issue what we needed, we made it ourselves, and we named it ourselves too, end quote. That's the heart of trench culture, not just improvisation, but the language that grew around it. One of the more dramatic weapons on the battlefield was a German 37mm anti-aircraft gun that fired strings of glowing tracer rounds straight into the sky. The effect looked like a vertical chain of fiery beads, and Canadian soldiers immediately dubbed it, wait for it, flaming onions. It sounds like something from a carnival, not a battlefield, but that, again, was the point. Humor made the terrifying feel almost manageable. Before we roll the music again, I want to do a little bit of scene setting. During the First World War, British and Canadian troops kept themselves entertained with one of the most infamous songs of the era, Mademoiselle from Armentières. It started as a simple marching tune, but it quickly became a kind of creative playground for soldiers. Every unit added its own verses, some clever, some ridiculous, and many that were, let's just say, enthusiastically bawdy. The humor came from the mock French phrases, the long-suffering mademoiselle, and the soldiers' willingness to poke fun at themselves, the war, and anything else that needed deflating. It was the perfect trench song. It was catchy, irreverent, endlessly customizable, French, and just naughty enough to make men laugh in the middle of a miserable war. So with that spirit, the humor, the mischief, and the camaraderie, here's the tune.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get all the steak, parlez-vous. The officers get all the steak, parlez-vous. The officers get all the steak, and all we get is a bellyache. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. might forget the gas and shell parley-loo. You might forget the gas and shell parley-loo. You might forget the gas and shell. You'll never forget the mademoiselle. Inky Pinky parley-loo. Inky Pinky parley-loo.
It's hard not to giggle when you hear that song. I mean, the tune is so familiar, and the words, I've heard so many different versions of that song from the First World War, and some of it gets pretty spicy. Speaking of spicy, rum rations were sacred in the First World War, not because they were generous, but because they were tiny, painfully tiny. By the time of the First World War, the official British and Commonwealth rum ration, which included the Canadian Expeditionary Force, was 1/4 of a gill, or about 2.5 fluid ounces, roughly 70 mils per man per day. It was issued at Stand 2, which was early in the morning when the soldiers manned the parapet in case of a dawn attack. It was also issued before major assaults, during freezing weather, and after heavy bombardments. For obvious reasons, the purpose was simple. It provided warmth, courage, and steadier nerves. Soldiers spoke about it with a kind of reverence. Private A.S. Bullock later wrote, quote, "The rum ration was the one thing we looked forward to. It warmed you right through," end quote. A Black Watch medical officer went even further, insisting, quote, "Had it not been for the rum ration, I do not think that we would have won the war," end quote. These weren't exaggerations. They were the plain truth of men who had lived through cold that cut straight through wool and skin, through nights when the mud froze around their boots, through mornings when courage needed just a little extra help. The rum itself arrived in heavy stoneware jars, and they were stamped with the initials SRD. Officially, that stood for Supply Reserve Depot. Unofficially, soldiers invented their own translations. Things like seldom reaches destination, or service rum diluted, and soon runs dry. The jokes were affectionate, but they were also commentary. The jar itself was a symbol of comfort, but also scarcity. It was always too small, too late, or too far away. Rum inspired more than jokes. It also inspired poetry. Trench newspapers printed verses that were half serious, half mocking tributes to the most beloved ration in the army. One poem included the line, quote, "O rum, thy warmth is better than 1,000 sermons," end quote. This was a sentiment that captured exactly how soldiers felt. Rum wasn't just a drink, it was a moment of humanity. Heaven. Another soldier wrote in his diary, quote, "The rum jar arrives and all is forgiven," end quote. That's a line that says more about morale than any other official report ever could. Rum didn't make the war easier. It didn't erase fear or fatigue or grief, but it made the next 10 minutes easier. It gave the men a brief sense of warmth, a flicker of courage, and a reminder that someone, somewhere, understood what they were enduring. In a world built to grind the human spirit down, that small measure of rum became a daily sacrament, a ritual of survival, a moment of being human before returning to the mud. It was so well loved that they wrote songs about it.
If the sergeant steals your rum,
Never mind,
If the sergeant steals your rum,
never mind.
though he's just a bloody sot, let him take the bleeding lot.
If the sergeant steals your rum, never mind, oh, never mind.
If old Jerry shells the trench,
Never mind. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind. Though the blasted sandbags fly, you have only once to die. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind, oh, never mind. Right, come on, lads, come on.
If you get stuck on the wire,
Never mind, never mind.
if you get stuck on the wire,
Never mind, never mind. Though the life's as broad as day, when you die they stop your pay. If you get stuck on the wire, never mind.
But rum could only carry a man so far. For everything else, the army relied on a different kind of miracle. The Canadians who didn't warm your soul so much as they rebuilt the entire front line before lunch. The Canadian railway troops were so fast, it genuinely unnerved people. These were men who could look at a stretch of cratered, shell-torn mud and say, yeah, we could put a railway through that by dinner. And then they actually did it. One NATO article highlights a statistic that still sounds like it should have come with a drum roll. 2.5 miles of track laid in just 16 hours. Not on a sunny day and not on level ground. Under fire. In mud. With half the tools held together by wire and optimism. Their speed became legendary. British officers watched them work with a mixture of admiration and mild alarm. One supposedly joked that if you left a Canadian railway unit alone for a day, they'd, quote, accidentally build a line to Berlin, end quote. It wasn't an official quote, more of a mess tent wisecrack, but it captured the mood perfectly. The Canadians were unstoppable. Give them rails, give them ties, give them a flat-ish surface, and they'd have the supply line running before anyone finished their tea. Part of the magic was who these men were. Many had been railway workers back home, track layers, engineers, surveyors, foremen. They arrived in Europe, already knowing how to build a railway from scratch. The Western Front simply gave them impossible conditions and said, good luck. And the Canadians replied, sure, but can we get more spikes? British officers wrote admiringly that Canadians worked with a speed and precision that astonished all who saw them. German intelligence reports described them as highly skilled and dangerously efficient, which is about as close as you get to a compliment from the other side. Their railways seemed to appear overnight. One moment there was mud, and the next there was a functioning supply line. So ammunition, food, water, artillery, everything moved because the Canadians made it possible. They didn't have to fight for territory. They fought for momentum, for the ability of an army to move, breathe, and survive. And it definitely was not glamorous work. No one wrote stirring poems about railway ballast, but it was heroic in its own way. The kind of heroism that looks like sweat, grit, and a line of track stretching into the dark. And if you had asked the Canadians how they did it, they probably would have shrugged and said something like, well, someone had to. Let's talk now a bit about that beautiful ancient place called Ypres, sometimes pronounced Ypres. That's spelled Y-P-R-E-S. The English-speaking soldiers called it wipers, for one simple reason. They couldn't pronounce Ypres, and they really couldn't. Wipers is kind of a funny play on the spelling, so wipers, Y-P-R-E-S, wipers. The French and Flemish pronunciation, somewhere between Ypres and Ypres, was so unfamiliar to British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops that they collectively gave up and invented their own version. The Strafe language unit confirms this directly. It became one of the most famous place name manglings of the entire war. Once a nickname appeared, it spread almost instantly. Soldiers loved humor that took the edge off fear, and mispronouncing a place that was otherwise synonymous with horror, like gas attacks, mud, and relentless shelling, gave them a tiny bit of control. It also fit perfectly into trench culture, where almost everything got renamed. Shells became whiz-bangs, mortars became flying pigs, the Minenwerfer became Mini, and Ypres became wipers. It was part joke, part coping mechanism, part linguistic survival. So at Ypres, or wipers, the battlefield had its own soundtrack. Artillery, machine gun fire, and the thump of mortars. But one stood out so much that it actually earned the name the Wipers Express. It wasn't a train, of course. It was a German shell, and it was a big one. It was fired with such regularity and such theatrical noise that soldiers began treating it almost like a scheduled service. And again, the Strafe language unit notes that Canadian troops loved giving weapons and shells nicknames, especially ones that made the terrifying feel almost domestic. This one fit the pattern perfectly. Loud, predictable, and impossible to ignore. So men swore they could hear it coming long before it arrived. It had a rising, rushing sound, a kind of mechanical howl that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. One soldier described shells like it as, quote, coming in with the roar of an express train, end quote, a comparison that appears again and again in wartime letters and memoirs. Another wrote that heavy shells announce themselves like a locomotive, which is probably the closest thing we have to an authentic quote behind the nickname. And because soldiers coped with fear by laughing at it, they treated this monstrous shell as if it was part of the local transit system. When it came screaming overhead, men joked that you could set your watch by it, though no one was eager to test the theory with their head above the parapet, so the joke wasn't about accuracy at all. If you could name something and if you could laugh at it, you could survive it. The Wipers Express became part of trench folklore, that idea of turning something terrifying into something funny or familiar. And that was the strange alchemy of trench life. If it tried to kill you, you named it. If it scared the hell out of you, you joked about it. And if it came roaring in like a train, well, I guess you gave it a timetable. The trenches had their own cast of characters too, not just the men, but the weapons themselves. The soldiers renamed almost everything around them, partly out of humor, defiance, and partly because giving a terrifying weapon a silly nickname made it just a little bit easier to face. Take the Stokes mortar bomb, for example. It was called a mouth organ because of the eerie, wailing sound it made as it sailed overhead. The term appears in wartime slang collections. The Colt machine gun earned the nickname potato digger. We talked about that before, and not because it had anything to do with farming, but because its operating arm swung back and forth as it fired, a motion soldiers thought looked exactly like someone digging up potatoes. Heavy shells had their own personalities too. A large shell passing high overhead was called a carpet slipper, a nickname chosen because of the soft, sweeping sound it made as it drifted through the air. French trench mortars were crapauds, a wonderfully mangled English version of the French crapaud, or toad. Soldiers weren't trying to be linguistically accurate, they were just trying to survive and communicate. And then there was the German Minenwerfer mortar, a short-range, brutally destructive weapon that Canadian soldiers refused to dignify with its proper name. So instead they all called it Mini, or depending on the day and the mood, a flying pig, a toffee apple, or a plum pudding. Each nickname carried this tiny spark of trench logic. A toffee apple because the bomb sat on a stick. I guess we call them candy apples nowadays. A flying pig because of its shape and the way it arced through the air. A plum pudding because it looked like one. Round, lumpy, and deeply unwelcome. Tim Cook explained why this renaming mattered so much. Quote, in a response to the industrialized nature of death, soldiers reacted to the impersonal killing devices of shells and bullets by drawing them back to the knowable and understandable. End quote. So in other words, Tim Cook was saying if it's going to try and kill you, you have to give it a name that you could live with. And so the trenches filled with this bizarre, explosive ensemble. Mouth organs and potato diggers, carpet slippers and crapos, minis and flying pigs. Each one renamed until it felt familiar and almost domestic. It was trench culture at its most human, turning fear into language and language into a shield. These facts that I'm throwing at you aren't just trivia. They're windows into the emotional world of soldiers who lived through the war. They show us, on a more serious side, how humor, creativity, and even absurdity helped men cope with the unthinkable. From a mental health standpoint, it was fought with language, imagination, and the stubborn refusal to let fear have the last word. And in their own way, these stories are acts of resistance. They say, we were here, we felt things, we laughed, and we survived it. So if trench humor had a visual language, it belonged to cartoons. And no one captured that world better than Bruce Bairnsfather. He wasn't Canadian. He was a British officer with a talent for drawing the absurdity of trench life, but Canadians adored him anyway. His cartoons spread through the trenches faster than lice. They were pinned to dugout walls, tucked into paybooks, traded like contraband, and reprinted until the paper gave up and disintegrated. The Canadian War Museum notes that Bairnsfather's cartoons were, quote, extremely popular among Allied soldiers, end quote. And it's not hard to see why. He drew the war the way soldiers actually lived it. Muddy, miserable, ridiculous, and somehow still survivable. His characters weren't heroic figures charging into glory. They were ordinary men trying to shave in a shell hole or brew tea under bombardment. Probably his most famous cartoon shows two exhausted soldiers huddled in a crater while shells burst around them. One of them looks at the other and says the immortal line, "Well, if you knows of a better 'ole, go get it." That line became universal. It was repeated in dugouts, in letters home, in trench newspapers. It was the unofficial motto of anyone who had ever been cold, wet, and out of options, which is to say every soldier on the Western Front. And Canadians embraced it wholeheartedly. They didn't just laugh at the cartoons, they clung to them. The Canadian War Museum's webpage includes a story about a Canadian soldier from No. 1 Field Ambulance who wrote home asking his mother not to throw away a book of Bairnsfather's drawings. He told her to keep it safe so he could laugh at the same pictures again when he finally got home. That isn't just comedy, that's a man planning for a future he desperately hopes exists. Bairnsfather's humor worked because it was honest. It didn't pretend the trenches were anything other than miserable. It didn't try to inspire or even uplift. It simply said, yeah, this is awful. Yes, we're still here, and yes, somehow we're going to laugh anyway. In a world where everything was bleak, his cartoons gave soldiers permission to smile, not because things were good, but because they were still human beings. So picture this. A soldier sits in a trench getting a haircut. Not in warm barracks, not in a quiet rear area camp. Right there in the mud, with shells whining overhead and the front line close enough to smell the cordite. It sounds ridiculous because it was, and that's exactly why it became a favorite subject of trench cartoons. One of the classic images shows a barber calmly trimming a soldier's hair while a shell whistles past. The customer is wide-eyed, gripping the plank he's sitting on, clearly reconsidering every life choice that led him to this moment. The barber, completely unfazed, leans in and says something along the lines of, "Hold still, mate, or I'll cut your ear off." It's ridiculous, and it's dangerous, and it's stupid, and it's exactly how trench life felt. The absurd and the deadly mashed together so tightly that soldiers sometimes couldn't tell where one ended and where the other began. The Canadian War Museum notes that trench humor thrived on this contrast, describing how soldiers used jokes and cartoons to cope with the monotony, discomfort, and danger of the front. A Haircut Under Fire captured all three of these at once. The routine, the misery, and the constant threat of being blown into next week. And that cartoon wasn't just funny, it was also a reminder. Even in chaos, routine continued and was necessary because hair still grew. And mud still needed scraping off of boots. Letters still needed writing, and life, stubborn, ordinary life, still demanded attention. Sometimes the only way to deal with the insanity was to laugh at it. So the cartoons weren't exactly escapism, they were kind of an emotional truth-telling. They showed the war as soldiers actually lived it. Terrifying, yes, but also boring, ridiculous, and occasionally so surreal that the only sane response was humor. For all the mud, misery, and artillery, the trenches were also home to something completely unexpected. Talent shows. Full productions. I'm not even kidding you right now. Costumes, scripts, musical numbers, the works. Sometimes if they were lucky enough, they had bell tents that seated a couple of hundred men. It sounds impossible. But to soldiers, it was survival. Whenever a unit rotated out of the front line, even if for a few days, men scrambled to create entertainment. They built makeshift stages out of ammunition boxes and they hung blankets as curtains. They scrounged candles, lanterns, and whatever else could pass for lighting. And then they performed for each other. Not just songs and poems, there were plenty of those, but full comedic reviews, satire, sketches, cross-dressing roles that brought down the house. Soldiers who had never acted a day in their lives suddenly discovered that they were brilliant at playing a flustered officer or a lovesick heroine. The Canadian War Museum notes that these shows were part of a broader trench culture pattern where humor helped soldiers cope with the strain of combat. And the shows did exactly that. They gave men something the war rarely offered, and that was a moment of joy or a moment of normalcy, a moment where the only explosions were from laughter. One Canadian soldier wrote that the concerts were the best medicine we had, and another joked that the performers were so good they, quote, could have taken Berlin with a banjo and a bad wig, end quote. The humor was often subversive, safely so. Officers were lampooned, generals were portrayed as pompous buffoons. The Kaiser made regular appearances as a melodramatic villain who couldn't catch a break. The audience roared because everyone understood the joke. This was the only place where a private could safely make fun of the entire chain of command.
If you want to find the Sergeant Major, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the Sergeant Major, I know where he is. He's hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen him, hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen him hanging on the old barbed wire. If you want to find the old battalion, I know where they are. I know where they are. I know where they are. If you want to find the old battalion, I know where they are. They're hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen them, hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen them hanging on the old barbed wire.
The shows weren't just popular, they were phenomena. Whenever a unit rotated out of the line, word spread fast, there's a concert tonight. Men packed into barns, attics, half-collapsed churches, requisitioned schools, YMCA huts, and any dugout large enough to hold a plank stage and a few dozen exhausted soldiers. If the roof leaked, they performed anyway. If shells fell in the distance, they paused, waited for the barrage to pass on, and then carried on. These weren't amateur affairs thrown together on a whim. Many units developed full concert parties, complete with scripts, costumes, props, and musical accompaniment. Historian Tim Cook notes that these shows became a vital part of morale, offering soldiers a rare chance to feel human again between rotations at the front. Some of these groups became so polished and so beloved that they effectively turned professional. One example of that, and probably the most famous, was the Princess Patricia's Comedy Company, formed from the members of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. I'm not kidding you. They didn't just perform for their own battalion. They toured behind the lines, playing to packed audiences of Canadians, British troops, Australians, and anyone else lucky enough to squeeze into a seat. Thousands saw them. Their posters were hand-drawn, their programs were printed, their jokes were sharp, their timing impeccable, and their cross-dressing roles were legendary. And they weren't alone. The 3rd Division had a troupe called the Dumbbells, who became so successful that after the war they toured Canada as a professional troupe, the first Canadian entertainers ever to perform on Broadway. I'm serious. They started the way most trench entertainment did, a handful of soldiers with a piano, or what was left of one, a few jokes, a borrowed dress or two, and an audience desperate for something, anything that wasn't artillery. But the Dumbbells had something special. They were sharp, they were funny, and they were polished in a way that made other units jealous. Word spread quickly behind the lines. If the Dumbbells are performing, get there early. Their shows mixed parody, sentimental songs, and sketches that poked fun at everything soldiers hated. The mud, the rations, the lice, the officers, the endless waiting. They were so good that even senior officers, the same ones being lampooned, came to watch. Laughter was a rare commodity. Nobody wanted to miss it. Whitfield Gannon was born on August 1st, 1895, at Snyder Mountain, New Brunswick. He was second cousin to the Gannon chocolatiers of nearby St. Stephen. and he and his family lived on a mixed farm. So he enlisted with the 64th New Brunswick Battalion and then transferred to the 104th Battalion. He then joined the 26th Battalion as a private and lance corporal and saw action at Vimy, Hill 70, and Passchendaele. Decades later, he took part in a pilgrimage back to France where he was shocked by the number of graves, yet awed by the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Mr. Guénon died on January 5, 1989, but he did give this interview to Veterans Canada.
And the dumbbells over there. I think that they were formed in 1916 from the 3rd Division by the name of Al Plunkett. He founded them. And not by golly, I hadn't talked about it for so long. But there was a female impersonator. He was a Hamilton. And then there was Red Newman. And he sang these songs. Oh, it's a lovely war. What do you want with eggs and ham when you got plum and apple jam? 4 and 4 is right turn. What do you do with the money? No. Oh, it's a lovely war. And they sing that, and they had the greatest singers, They sing Roses of Purity, all these nice songs. You'd think it was a woman. During the winter when we were preparing for Vimy, that was the first time. Then we saw them many times after that, of course. And I always just enjoyed them.
So when it came to the dumbbells, the audiences were enormous. Thousands of soldiers saw them in makeshift theaters across France and Belgium. They performed in whatever places they could secure. Men packed in shoulder to shoulders, sitting on ammunition boxes, sandbags on the floor. If the roof leaked, they kept going. If the shells fell, they kept going. The show always went on. But the real miracle came after the war. When the armistice was signed, most concert parties disbanded, but the dumbbells didn't. They regrouped, rewrote their material, and took their act on the road. In 1919, they launched a cross-Canada tour and became a sensation. They sold out theaters from Halifax to Vancouver. They recorded music. They published sheet music. They became celebrities. And in 1921, they did something no Canadian troupe had ever done before. They performed on Broadway, the first Canadian entertainers in history to do so.
In the paper just the other morning, while I was yawning, I read in dismay. Right across the page, too many women, my brain was swimming, I fainted away. That is what some lunatic had written, and someone had printed as well. We've 1,000,000 too many girls in Britain. Then I threw down my paper to yell. Too many girls, a thing's impossible. There can't be too many girls. There may be too many flowers and beautiful things in this world of ours. Too many girls, why don't they tell us the sea has too many pearls? The Daily Mail as a paper is a good one, and there may be too many plums inside a pudding, but there can't be, absolutely can't be too many beautiful girls.
Their show, Biff Bing Bang, opened at the Ambassador Theatre, and New York critics loved them. Imagine that. A group of former soldiers who had once performed in muddy barns behind the front lines, now playing to packed houses in the world's most famous theatre district. Canadians to boot. It's one of those stories that feels almost too perfect. The kind of arc a novelist would hesitate to write because it sounds unbelievable. But it happened. And it happened because humor wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was talent. It was creativity. It was culture being born in the unlikeliest place imaginable. The dumbbells proved something profound, that even in a war built to destroy, something beautiful could still take shape. The laughter didn't just help the men survive, it helped them create. And long after the trenches were gone, the jokes kept echoing on stages across Canada and the United States, reminding audiences that the human spirit can be battered, but it doesn't break easily. These shows allowed the soldiers to forget the front, They could forget the danger, and they could remember who they were before the war tried to grind it out of them. And when the curtain fell, usually a blanket hung from a beam, they walked back into the night a little lighter, a little steadier, and a little more themselves. In a war defined by industrialized death, a makeshift stage and a bad wig could do something extraordinary. They could give men back their humanity, if only for an evening. Trench life didn't just have its own slang and its own jokes and its own songs. It had its own economy, and it ran on a currency far more valuable than money. In the trenches, pay meant almost nothing. You couldn't buy comfort, you couldn't buy safety, you couldn't even buy a dry place to sit. But you could buy something far more precious: dry socks. Trench foot was a constant, lurking threat. The kind of danger that didn't explode or whistle overhead, but quietly destroyed you from the toes upward. Feet that stayed wet for too long could swell, crack, rot, and become infected. Soldiers described it as a misery that never left you, and medical officers warned that untreated trench foot could cost a man his ability to walk or his life. This was a very real threat. So dry socks became a kind of frontline gold standard. Unofficial trades sprang up everywhere. A pair of dry socks might get you chocolate. 2 pairs could buy you someone else's turn on sentry, a priceless exchange on a freezing night. 3 pair? Now you were dealing in luxury goods. You could get letters written, errands run, watches covered, or chores quietly reassigned. One Canadian soldier joked in a letter home that socks were worth more than sovereigns, and he wasn't exaggerating. When the Canadian War Museum talks about soldiers using humor to cope with the monotony, discomfort, and danger, the sock economy fit right into that pattern. Men teased each other about hoarding socks the way misers hoarded gold. They accused each other of sock speculation. They joked that quartermasters guarded dry socks more fiercely than ammunition. And beneath the humor was a really simple truth, and that was that dry socks meant survival. They meant one more day without infection, one more march without agony, and one more chance to keep your feet, literally, under you. They were comfort, protection, and bargaining power all rolled into one. And the trenches actually had many economies. There were rum, cigarettes, chocolate, favors, but socks were the one item that every man understood instinctively. They weren't just clothing, they were insurance. They were almost like hope. They were the difference between hobbling and marching, between staying in the line and being carried out of it. And so the trades continued, quietly, constantly, a little black market of wool and desperation. No receipts, no ledgers. Just the unspoken agreement that in the mud of the Western Front, a dry pair of socks was worth almost anything. Before long, that same stubborn humor showed up not just in letters and diaries, but in the way Canadians trained. If the trenches had their own economy and their own language, Canadian training camps had their own climate, one that convinced British officers that the CEF was either extraordinarily tough or quietly trying to kill its own recruits. Canadian training camps were their own kind of battlefield, not against the Germans, but against the weather. When the first contingent began training at Valcartier, Quebec in 1914, and later at Salisbury Plain in England, the British officers supervising them were stunned by what the Canadians considered acceptable conditions. During the winter of 1914-15, the temperatures at Valcartier plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius and below. Snowstorms swept across the camp, frostbite cases mounted, and the Canadians kept drilling. British officers visiting the camp were horrified. One observer wrote that the Canadians were training in conditions, quote, no English regiment would tolerate, and another noted that the men seemed, quote, impervious to cold that would cripple others, end quote. The British genuinely wondered whether this was training or some kind of colonial hazing ritual. The Canadians, for their part, were baffled by the concern. They shrugged, stomped their boots, and offered the kind of reassurance that reassured absolutely no one. It's warm today. This did not help. When the CEF later moved to Salisbury Plain, the British expected the Canadians to collapse under the famous English winter rains. Instead, the Canadians treated the mud like an old friend. One British officer wrote that the Canadians, quote, took to the weather with a cheerfulness that astonished us, while another admitted that their tolerance for misery was positively alarming, end quote. The Canadians joked that the British winter was practically tropical compared to home. Meanwhile, the British watched men drill in sleet and sideways rain and wondered if perhaps the Dominion had forgotten to send instructions on how to feel cold. Canadian soldiers themselves leaned into the humor. One wrote home that the weather was, quote, a bit chilly, but nothing to write mother about, end quote, which was a heroic understatement for a camp where tents froze solid overnight. Another joked that the British officers kept asking if they needed warming huts, and the Canadians kept replying, quote, only if you're cold, sir, end quote. The result was kind of a cultural standoff, the British insisting the weather was dangerous and the Canadians insisting that the weather was Tuesday. But the toughness paid off. When the Canadians reached the Western Front, the British commanders repeatedly commented on the Canadians' resilience in cold, wet, and miserable conditions. Their winter training, accidental or otherwise, had hardened them in ways no manual could teach. And it all began with a simple, terrifyingly Canadian philosophy. If you can still feel your face, keep drilling. When Canadian soldiers arrived on the Western Front, they stepped into a linguistic universe the British had been building since 1914, a world of nicknames, sarcasms, and phrases polished by decades of imperial service. The British Army, too, had slang for everything: food, officers, weapons, weather, and especially misery. It was practically a second language. The Canadians, though new to the war, brought their own vocabulary. Part frontier practicality, part regional flavor, part we're not saying that, it sounds silly. Before long, the trenches became kind of a bilingual comedy routine. Both armies used slang for the same reasons: to build camaraderie, to create an insider identity, and to soften the brutality of trench life. But the way each group expressed those ideas sometimes diverged in ways that were subtle, and sometimes not subtle at all. So here's some examples, some comparisons between the Canadian and British linguistics in the trenches. The British often described an easy assignment as cushy. It's a word we still use today, which is kind of cool. It was a word borrowed from Hindi during Britain's long presence in India. Canadians, by contrast, use the term soft job, which appears in Canadian publications of the time. Same meaning, it's just a task far from the front lines, ideally indoors, preferably involving no risk of being shot. But then the Canadian version had a plain-spoken, almost prairie practicality to it. It was a difference between empire and homestead. The British borrowed from the Raj. The Canadians borrowed from common sense. Both armies called their helmets tin hats, but only the Canadians talked about larrigans, the waterproof boots issued to them. The British had no equivalent term because they had no equivalent boots. When a soldier admitted he was scared, he might say he had the wind-up or the wind-up. Both British and Canadian troops used the phrase. It was a gentle, humorous way of acknowledging terror without losing face. And when someone died, both armies said he had gone west. It was poetic, understated, and easier to say than the truth. In the end, CEF slang was a blend. It was part inherited, part adapted, and part uniquely Canadian. The British provided the foundation, but the Canadians made it their own, weaving their experiences, their humor, and their cultural background into the shared language of the trenches. It's a reminder that even in the mud and chaos of the Western Front, identity found a way to express itself, one slang term, one joke, one whiz-bang at a time. Humor didn't just live in the trenches, it traveled in the envelopes, tucked between reassurances and half-truths. So trench humor, as we know, often carried a quietly subversive edge. It wasn't rebellion, not the dangerous kind, but it was absolutely a form of resistance. Soldiers used jokes the way miners used canaries, to test the air, to release pressure, to remind themselves that they were still alive. It mocked officers, it poked holes in propaganda, it shrank vast, terrifying forces into manageable jokes and doodles, but it always did so carefully. A cartoon could say what a private could never dare say out loud. A doodle of a clueless officer or a pompous general could circulate in a dugout long before anyone thought to whisper the same criticism. A joke muttered over a tin mug of tea could deflate fear without crossing the invisible line between humor and insubordination. It was the pressure valve that kept the whole system from exploding. So when we talk about the CEF, we talk about courage and sacrifice and endurance, and we should. But we should also talk about laughter. Humor wasn't decoration, it was armor. It was a way for the ordinary men to push back against the world designed to crush him. We're going to hear one more time from Wilfred Ganong, and he's talking about just bits of humor that happened when they'd gone into a bombed out area. And just word of warning, there is some time appropriate, let's just call it a racial slur, that is in this little clip. And just remember that this is how things were said back then. It is no reflection on this podcast or 2026. So have a listen to this.
Funny thing happened when we went over in 1916. We went to Nouveau St. Vaast, and the town, the buildings were all blown down, and we went down into a basement. That was to be our home, and you're going in there. Prospects didn't look so rosy, did it? And so again, it was booming. And there was a darky from Halifax. He'd been down to the Somme, and he survived. And he was a ventriloquist, and he threw his voices. And that got us all amused, you see. And that made the night much better, And it's a funny thing about all these people that were really good at amusing people. They were killed later. He was killed shortly after, you see.
So humor handed back a sliver of control, a tiny, defiant spark of individuality in a system built to grind individuality away. It let soldiers look at something terrifying and make it smaller, sillier, more manageable. It let them talk about fear without naming it. It let them survive without hardening into stone. And in the end, the story of the Canadian Expeditionary Force isn't just a story of battles won or ground held. It isn't only Vimy Ridge or Passchendaele or the Somme. It's also the story of the small, stubborn acts that kept men human in a place designed to erase humanity. The jokes whispered in dugouts, the cartoons pinned to mud-soaked walls, the slang that turned terror into something you could name and therefore face. Tim Cook reminded us that soldiers used humor because it pulled the war back into the realm of the knowable and understandable. It made the unthinkable just thinkable enough to survive, and maybe that's the thread running through everything we've talked about. The weapons with ridiculous nicknames, the trench newspapers, these weren't just quirks of language or culture. They were lifelines. They were proof that even in the worst conditions imaginable, people reached instinctively for connection and for meaning and for something to hold on to. So when we remember the Canadian Expeditionary Force, we remember their courage and their sacrifice, and we remember their endurance, but let's also remember their laughter. Not because it made the war any less deadly, but because it made the men who fought it feel even for a moment less alone. And maybe that's the most human truth of all, that even in the mud, under fire, and even when the world narrowed to a trench and a rifle and the next shell incoming, someone always found a way to laugh. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Memory and Valor. I am so pleased that you were able to come and listen to this, and I hope that it gave you a few laughs. I hope that it made your eyebrows go up in all kinds of ways, because doing the research for this episode, it was a lot of fun. And I'll be honest with you, there were lots of times recording this podcast episode where I had to stop because I was giggling a little too hard. So anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking with me here, and I will see you next time. In the meantime, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.